next? Yes, we can talk about the here and now for regulation in the UK or upcoming in Brazil, but it's what's next.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the SiGMA podcast. Today with our guest, Peter Murray, the Director of Strategy for Mitek. Peter, good morning, and thank you for accepting our invite.
Good morning, Trevor. Delighted to join. I'm looking forward to it. Should be fun.
Yeah, it should be fun. I mean, you're someone, well, in Italian they say parola facile. To you, speaking comes natural and it comes quite easy. And you're one of those who, at every conference I attend, and you're usually there, you're always someone who either is on a panel or else is asking the questions. So I think today should be pretty interesting. And on that note, if I may ask, because some people say, listen, we're always going to the same conferences, to the same shows, same expos. At the end of the day, we're always getting the same information. So why should I go to one expo and not to the other?
Yeah, look, really interesting, because I think if we're all honest with ourselves, there's way too many events, right? And as I would criticize it for the same people talking about the same things, and yet I am one of those people. And don't get me wrong, I love what I do. I've been in this industry for 14, 15 years. Being identity very much focused on the gambling side, but it can be very vanilla, it can be the same. So the bit I do, the sort of strategy bit within my role, is looking to the future. Okay. So the bits I like to talk about around identity are what's coming next. Yes, we can talk about the here and now for regulation in the UK or upcoming in Brazil, but it's what's next. But I guess when it comes to events themselves and expos, it's just those trying to put a slightly different angle on it, whether it be in Malta or ICE or in the US. Who's looking at what's coming next? Who's getting...
Don't forget SiGMA, please. Don't forget SiGMA.
You can't forget SiGMA. You can't forget SiGMA, because SiGMA's, if you look at the key 2 or 3 in the sector, ICE out of London, although that's moving, SiGMA, and then G2E are the really big ones. So absolutely, SiGMA's a key part of that.
So you just mentioned strategy, and actually I want to usually ask this question at the end right now, but given that you've just mentioned strategy and what's next, what are you seeing as what's next in A, the short term, but B, the medium long term as well?
I think that's coming on my area of expertise, which is around the identity piece. The thing about identity, AML, KYC, is that it's always changing. It's always evolving. And if anything, the technology of obviously which Mitek are part of, but also the data that's in there, that's having to adapt. It's coming from a much more time-stamped, once only you found me on a database, through to now regulators are very much pushing for a sort of real-time understanding of the customer, what's changing, when it's changing, and be able to react to that. So I think there's a couple of interesting stuff. I think short term, if you look at the various regulations, they're going to come in with things around financial health. So do people or can people afford to do what they're doing? Now, it's a whole debate on whether we should be doing that, but short term, driven by the UK, that's going to be a big part of that process going forward. So not only I am who I am, it's am I able to do that? I think longer term, sort of the next sort of 3 to 5 years, there's some really interesting, really disruptive things happening in the identity space that will affect the gambling industry. And if I just pick out one within Europe, that's identity wallets. So the power is moving from vendors like Mitek through to back to the individual. The ability to say, I'm going to release what data I think is necessary for you to open up a bank account or a gambling account or hire a car. So for me, that's the really interesting bit, because Europe has this identity wallet process for the next 5 years, which will ultimately mean I control my data and I release the data that comes to the gambling company.
So who excuse me, because maybe I misunderstood, and also the audience will need to understand. So there are people who act as gatekeepers for someone's data, or is the individual the gatekeeper of his own data?
So there's two parts to that, I guess. Is one, what will happen in 5 years or the next 5, 6 years is around identity wallets. You hold that in the phone. So the power of your identity will be held within whatever your smart device is. And whether when you're applying for a loan or a house or a gambling company, you will release parts of that. So what that does is protect the data. So it will release something that says it's Peter Murray and he's over 18 and he's verified. But that's it. You don't need to have all this type in your address, type in all the other details, run off to various data sources. Now, the other interesting part, that's who's going to hold that data. So if you look at, I don't know, who's going to trust Apple? Who's going to trust Facebook? Is it going to be a bank? Is it going to be somebody like Mitek? So that's where the battleground's going to be, I think, is understanding who's your word is absolutely right, which is the gatekeeper of that. Because I will control whether I release my details to a gambling company, which parts of it go out to them, what they need to do to open up account or to do EDD. That's the direction of travel. And that's where companies like ours and others in the space are sort of working around to work out how that looks in the future. The here and now stuff is pretty traditional, Trevor. Not much has changed over the last few years, other than it's more of a real-time check on that individual. And then some checks in the background, which I think for us, it's trying to make that seamless, trying to remove friction. But actually, if you go down the UK route, and you seem to be talking affordability, then that can become pretty intrusive. Open banking, decent source is fine, but who's going to release that to a gambling company? You'll do it for a bank, you'll do it for a loan, you'll do it for a house, but who's going to want to open up their bank details to a gambling company? So that friction between what regulation wants, what the customers are prepared to give, and what vendors like ourselves can get access to. That's the really constantly evolving part of the identity piece.
Okay. So usually I ask those questions at the end, but given the way we started off, we also have to make a comment here for our audience. We actually started this recording yesterday, but unfortunately technology failed us. And we started yesterday on a completely different note, but as you can see, the podcast takes a nature of its own, depending on what we start discussing. Now, you've mentioned a number of fairs and expos. You've mentioned the UK market. Regarding data, identity, KYC, which is your area of let's say, specialization in the gaming sector.
Yep.
With the advent of Brexit and with the changes which were taking place, has the UK taken on the European data protection legislation, or is the UK going down its own route on data protection, if I may ask?
Look, you can ask. We probably need a politician to give you that answer. I think it's. Hey, look, Trevor, I'm your prime example. If you don't like Brexit, you can leave. I didn't like Brexit. I now live in Spain. I was fortunate to get out before the end of Brexit. But I think, look, if we take out the emotion of what happened with Brexit, what it's left the UK with is trying to replicate effectively what it already had, but their own versions of that. So GDPR, etc. The UK was one of the instigators of that at the very start of the European side. So from everything that we can see and the rules that are coming out, it is effectively a replica of what's already there. Nobody's going to reinvent the wheel. It's like regulation within gambling. You have that core principle of AML, GDPR. Every jurisdiction adds its own little nuance, its own little twist on that. And I think the UK is in a position where it's awkward outside of the EU. It's following its own track down that route. So I think those areas are all there to be confirmed. And let's face it, what are we, 3 or 4 years out from Brexit? The government is still not big. There's an election next year in our world. The gambling regulations are up for review, and as we know, that politics is a big part of that. People deciding on which laws are going to come in. So I think the biggest problem or the biggest concern the UK has isn't so much in the gambling sense, is around what that new gambling law is going to look like. How onerous are the checks going to be?
If I may, I asked this question also to Chris Elliott, who I had on another podcast. in all likelihood, without wanting to get into the merits of politics with a capital P, that is party politics. But the likelihood is we're going to be seeing a change in the United Kingdom in the government. And from what I've been told, the likelihood is that there seems to be a sort of stricter, even though it's already a strict approach, but a stricter approach to gaming. So do you think that the legislative proposal would remain the same with the change in government, or will the legislation go through before the election, which, if one looks at political strategy, then, I mean, gaming doesn't win you any votes. If anything, it loses votes for you. So would you do that, even though you're already heading towards a bad result?
Yeah. Look, I think if I was a politician, I would push this can down the road. Whatever happens in the next election, and it is looking like we'll have a change of government. Gambling is a heavily politicized sector. Ultimately, it's not driven just by facts and sense sometimes, but it's driven by the politics, emotions, the media, the public perception. And if you look at the debate, emotions. Yeah, of course. And I think if you look at the debate over the last, say, 4 or 5 years in the UK, it's heavily focused on harm minimization, problem gambling, affordability, all those issues that we've moved on from the identity. And let's face it, the last time the laws in the UK were changed for gambling, we didn't really have online like we've got it now. So I accept that the regs have to change, make them fit for purpose for the modern day, but ultimately it's heavily politicized. So I expect it to be tougher. I expect it to be more onerous. You would hope that the decisions are made on fact and the stats that are out there rather than thoughts and pressures from politics. But we've sort of seen it before. The difference is this time will affect the next 10 to 15 years. So will it change? I guess the question was, will a change of government affect that? Ultimately, I've no idea. Traditionally, the Conservatives are more business friendly when it comes to things like this. So you'd expect less regulation. Labour, I don't know. They've got some pretty vociferous MPs within there. I guess all anybody in the industry would base it on the actual real stats that are out there, whether it be harm minimization, problem gambling, etc. We can only hope, Trevor.
So you've been with Mitek for, I think it's around 8 months, right?
Yeah,
8 months. But you've been in the sector for a long time.
Yeah.
How did you actually get involved in the gaming sector, and why the gaming sector? What attracted you to the sector, or did you fall into it by accident?
No, I guess like a lot of people, I fell into it by accident. I was busy running a business had offices in Eastern Europe and the UK. I knew one of the MDs of the company, I then went to work for. He asked me to help him out for 6 months. I didn't know the tech industry, if I'm honest, but what I did know was running a business and working with customers. And I came in to help him out for 6 months, and then 9.5 years later, I was still there. And it was only at that point I moved on. I've been sort of 14 years in the industry now. But I generally found really quickly, I love the gambling sector. It's very tech oriented, it's very dynamic. It has its challenges around a number of issues, but the fact is I generally loved what was going on. And the identity piece that I specialize in, that's constantly changing. The differences between the identity piece 14 years ago and now is immense, from data stamped once only to dynamic and evolving real-time identity now. So I think I got in by accident. I'm really glad I did. No intention of going anywhere else. Because I think both I get now to look at what's happening, both now to support clients from a compliance piece, but also what's coming down the line where, a bit like we mentioned earlier, on identity wallets. So for me, got in by accident, really glad I did. Going nowhere anytime soon, hopefully.
Okay. And how have you found it in general, the gaming sector to operate in?
Yeah, I think, I'm not too sure. I've done a number of different sectors over my time at a high level and big numbers. This in one respect is not that much different. It's still about relationships. It's still about providing quality products, whether you're an operator or a supplier like ourselves. What I do find is just fast moving. I think it's tech orientated. It's really dynamic. There's been an interesting change across that time scale. So the people who set up the online identity companies originally have sort of moved out and sold up and moved on as we become much more corporate. There's a power-based shift from the operators here in Europe over to the US as you get the power of the US dollar coming in and trying to buy up both the technology and the companies that go with that. So there's a fascinating shift in ownership and the type of people you will deal with. And then I think that'll just keep changing, because I think the other thing that really interests me dealing with operators and governments and regulators is the new regulations that are coming. So if we look at this, almost the single focus for 2024 for the sector is going to be Brazil and LATAM. We've got Peru regulates in February. Brazil has regulated, but comes in July. And so for me, that evolving, helping regulators sort of script out and deliver on regulations that sort of keep them compliant but protect players is really interesting, using that technology and data. So I think that's why I've always loved it, because it keeps changing and it's how technology and data combine. So yeah, I think for this year, for the sector, it's all about Brazil, Trevor. Everybody's going to be in on it. If you can't afford a $25 million license in the US, Brazil. And I'll tell you what's been interesting as Brazil has finally headed towards regulation is sort of how they've laid out the identity piece, how they've laid out the AML, KYC piece that operators are going to have to do.
In what sense?
Well, so there's three at the moment. From everything we can see from regulation, there's three things the operator's got to do. So in the UK, you would just find me on a database, and you find 2 levels of that, and that gets you a 2+2. But in Brazil, there's 3 things. There's document. You've then got to connect to the CPF number, which is the tax number in Brazil. And then the intriguing bit is they've mandated biometrics. What we're not sure yet whether it's biometrics as standard as Mitek would do it, which is what we do every day, or whether there's some other form of government database that we've got. So we know there's a government biometric database within Brazil. Is it access to that? So it seems to have gone direct to government database and using technology.
So wait a second. If I'm understanding correctly, for a player to register, he needs to go through this government database, right?
Yeah.
So an operator would have to plug in. Every operator would have to plug in, or would a data identity solution be the middleman in this?
Well, it's highly likely that it's going to come through somebody like us. So, our big push is it's an orchestration layer. You integrate once, you can access 50 different data sources. If you're an operator, what you want from vendors like us is you want less suppliers, but more from them. So I think that's why there's an appetite for this orchestration layer, which is, I don't want, if I've got 27 jurisdictions, I don't want 27 different in-country suppliers for identity. What I want is a platform that can plug them all in. So that would be our bigger push. There's other people who do similar sort of things, but the idea is they'll come to somebody like us and they'll open up Peru. They'll have all the data sources. Those data sources I talked about for Brazil, we have. So it's accessed through one API. It's very sort of regulation is the most costly and complex part of an operator's process. So it's a big push to try and streamline that. So whether it's the UK and it goes down affordability, Germany has to combine all their overall spend for a month. Brazil's going to be around making sure the biometrics are part of it, which from a tech perspective is really interesting.
Okay. Are there many other countries which go down the biometrics route?
I think any country regulating now or from here on in knows that that technology is there, right? And let's face it, if we can open up our bank accounts on our phones, if we can hire a car just by using our tablet, then they know that this technology is there, and it does these things. It's a bit like removing passwords, and protecting your identity. It's very difficult to change your face, not so difficult to change your address. Opening up, one of the big things coming up, I think, the next couple of years is going to be removing your passwords just by showing your face. So that biometric authentication. So if you're a regulator, you're going to know this technology's out there. The challenge is, do you understand it, and are you a bit nervous about it? Because there is a perception out there that Big Brother watching you, all of that sort of stuff. But this is very sort of defined and deliverable it's a face that opens up the access to your accounts and your data. Yeah, this isn't something of the government sort of taking access to you. This isn't all of the sort of stuff you might get in China. This is about how you use data and technology to make your life easier. And the impact it has on the gambling sector is all around identity and access to your accounts. It's a bit like multiple accounts and tying everything up within the CSM database. So I think that's one of those big areas that regulators are going to try to stay on top of, which is obviously difficult. We've all met regulators, we've all dealt with them, dealt with governments. The government officials, do they really understand the technology?
Yeah,
and I think
what worries me. Well, know what worries me, Peter, is, for example, you have some countries which went down the route of, for example, having a vault solution, but then you have other countries which went down the route of you need to plug in through an actual government-owned interface, and that usually means you have a single point of failure for all your gaming market. Absolutely. Not for efficiency, but actually it increases inefficiency. So this is where I'd like to go with the question about Brazil. Are we looking at a single point of failure, or are we looking at a tool which will assist in registration and strengthen the KYC process?
I think it does completely depend on the government at the time. So for me, I'm a big one of the competitive marketplace. If you've got a government sourced database, then if you can provide or find trusted suppliers, data protected, all of that, it feels like it's better to offer it competitive to a number of different people like us, but whoever else does what we do. I think your point there is, how often have we seen governments try to do tech projects and it all goes wrong? Yeah, quite often. I think if I remember back in Italy in the day and the Catici Fiscali and the link to them, if you try to build your own, these people have lunch hours, the technology goes down. We're driven by the fact that if our systems ever go down, A, the client's going to get massively upset and probably walk, and B, we don't make any money. You don't have that same driver or a competitive nature if it's just the government source. So for me, and I would say that because I'm in the sector, but it feels like if there's a government source there and the data can be protected, offer it to vendors, we will provide that link and tie it up with other biometrics, other parts of that, because it's never a single point of contact. Yeah, it's never a single, take Brazil, it's not just the CPF database. You have to tie that into a document, you have to tie that into biometrics. Governments will consistently fail to deliver on tech projects. The challenge is then, how do you do it? Do you just give it to people like us? Do you make it available direct to the operators? So the way it seems to work more efficiently, you use the word efficiently, it seems more efficiently at the moment, is through technology, reg tech companies like ourselves and multiple ones of them, because the customer has to have the choice of who they want to do that with. And then it's competitive for us to try and make the best solution possible. It's like it's like being an operator. There's loads of people do what you do. How do you differentiate yourself? So back to the original question, I think for me, it's if that data's there, it should be available to all, and we will then decide, or the operators will decide who they choose to partner with.
Are the timeframes on the progress in Brazil?
Yeah, so as we stand right here, right now, it was signed off by the president on the 30th of December. Our understanding is licenses will be there to be applied for in February. So that's next month as we're recording. There's been 134 expressions of interest for licenses, although there's something like 4,000 betting companies in Brazil, but 134 said they want to do it. A lot of the usual suspects, plus the regular ones within the country. And then what we're thinking of is it's mid-July for go live date. So they will set a firm date. It looks like the operators will have 6 months to be able to get their systems in place. So you imagine if you're an operator, you've got X amount of customers. You want to re-verify them to the limit that's been set by the regulator, because whatever you've done now isn't enough. Yeah, most operators have taken them on, done a minimum of KYC. That will not fit with it. So the challenge an operator has, they've got thousands of customers in sort of on their site now. They're going to have to upgrade all of them. So the race for us as a vendor is to A, make sure we've got a compliant solution, and B, we have to help them get, because if go live date is July the 1st, for example, Everybody who comes on after that will have to be re-verified. So what you want to do is re-verify them to a compliant level first. So the race is on between now and some point in July for both operators and vendors like us to create that environment where the customer is already verified. Because I think there's 29 million active accounts in Brazil. This will be the biggest market opening we see, certainly in my time in the industry. And the talk out there is of trying to verify over nearly 100 million people who will then know it's regulated, feel safer, come into it. It's a vast project. I was around in 2014, Trevor, when Denmark regulated. They set a date of January the 1st. It was everybody that came on had to be verified, had to be re-verified that day. And that was a challenge. And that's 5 million people. We're talking about 200 million people and the focus of the world gambling sector on it. It's going to be really, both exciting and a bit nerve-wracking.
Peter, the time has flown by. It really was a pleasure to host you. Also, I'd like to remind the audience, please, before we actually close off, about SiGMA Eurasia, which is taking place in Dubai between the 25th and the 27th of February. The event, which will be another leading event for the different sectors which SiGMA actually is promoting. So I urge you to visit the sigma.world website to find more information about this event and other events which are taking place. And Peter, I thank you so much for being with us today and having such an interesting discussion. Much appreciated.